next here actually is Stephan. Stephan Pauleit, Professor Stephan Pauleit is a professor at the Technical University in Munich, but not least also a professor at University of Copenhagen. And in that capacity is also the actual leader of the Green Search project and has been leading that for the last couple of years. And Stephan, in that role and with all your specialities within green infrastructure planning and management, please. Do you want this?
Yeah, I take the mic. So yes, good morning. I think I will take this now always with me. This little guidebook. It's really something maybe I will even sleep with it. Thank you very much for this nice welcome. I really would like to express my deepest gratitude to the city of Malmö for inviting us, hosting us, and generously, very generously supporting this conference. I think there could be no better place than Malmö, which is a true front runner, as Andreas Schönström already told us, in the way towards moving to transformation, to more sustainable and climate-resilient development via urban green infrastructure. Augustenborg, Bonol-Ed, but also Toftanes, the stormwater management park, and so have been already early examples. And it's so impressive to see that the city is also following at the strategic level now this route and implementing this in all parts of policies. And at the same time being a growing city and trying to manage these tensions. Thank you not only to the mayor and the deputy mayor for inviting us to Malmö, but also to some of the collaborators in the Green Search project that have supported us also so well. Camilla Andersson from the planning department, Andreas Morsen has supported us as part of the Green Search team, and Tim Delsamar are here. And there must be others around. So thank you very much for that. My role will be now to introduce the Green Search project, give you a rough overview in the time until the coffee break. Before I start, I would also like to express or say a couple of other things. And one in particular is that the reason why I am standing in front of you now and giving this talk is that somebody else decided to take on a new adventure, and that is Cecil Konijnendijk, who is sitting here in front of us. He was the one that originally conceived the project and led us through the first 3 years. And then he decided to go to Canada to take up a new position at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. So it's you who should be here, but now I took over for finalizing the project and will try to present you a little bit about this project. And well, with this, I hope I didn't forget too many others to thank, but I will save the time, and there will be other opportunities also to say thank you to others. But instead, I would rather like to give you now an overview of the project. Actually, if I had known that Helena is so nicely talking about the project, I thought I could have saved the last few days in preparing this talk and just let her go and take the rest of it. But now you have to stand me and have a look at some of the results of the Green Search project. It's of course a challenge to do this in 20 minutes. So apologies to all members of the Green Search team if you will see that I'm just jumping from one topic to the next and maybe not properly reflecting on all of your research. Overall, we delivered 30 deliverables. So reports, one could say. That's the talk of the European Commission, deliverables. And if you say that each of these deliverables has on average maybe 80 pages or so, you can imagine how much paper was produced during these 4 years. And it's impossible, of course, in 20 minutes to give justice to all of that has been done in this project. What was the starting point of this project? The term green infrastructure is already around much longer, but our starting point was in particular the adoption of the European Green Infrastructure Strategy by the European Commission in 2013. And that is just the year also when our project started. I think this Green Infrastructure Strategy is remarkable in several aspects or respects, because it marks for me, in my understanding, a move away from purely conservationist approaches towards protecting ecosystems or invaluable natural areas, thinking mostly about species, towards an approach which is strategic. So it talks about strategically planned networks of green and blue spaces. So it's forward-thinking activity which tries to align itself with the societal needs for development. It talks about natural and semi-natural areas, but also about areas with other environmental features. And if you look at this slide here, then you can see that it also shows roof greening and other technical features, and it shows settlements. And that is a very big move forward as well, I think. It not only looks at rural areas, more or less natural areas, but it expressly includes urban areas into its equation, because there is a recognition that all of us, almost all of us, are living in urban areas, and that this is where, as we say in Germany, the music plays. And it looks at multiple ecosystem services, at the benefits that these provide to human society, so it is extending far beyond protecting species, as important as these are for providing these ecosystem services. And such an approach is in particular needed for urban areas, I believe, and we believe in Green Search, because urban areas have to meet a number of challenges that are shown here very briefly, and I'm not going into any detail. But what is interesting perhaps is that these challenges not only address also the more traditional concerns like biodiversity, which are also conservation, which are also already more established in the planning or the management of green spaces, but there are other issues that come very much to the forefront. Of course, climate change adaptation, but then also all these aspects of our human society, well-being of the people living in urban areas, and that's a very broad term that one could discuss a long time, what is included in that, and social cohesion. I found this so nice here that we had this little group of chicklings standing in front of us and singing this song, a very mixed group of people, and that's our society. And we are doing our work for these young ones here in the future. That's also why it's so important to take a strategic perspective that looks at 2050 and maybe even beyond in what we are doing today. Yeah, green is great. Green is great. That is now the saying of the day, I would say. And you find a lot of publications of this sort here around. This is a German magazine, maybe you know it, Geo. They talk about the green revolution. And there's a lot of evidence that green can do good to cities. And only I get sometimes a little bit suspicious of this wave. And maybe I'm too much of kind of scientist and think about, okay, should we really promise too much? And shouldn't we be a little bit more sober in our approach and think more harder about what really can be achieved by green, but in particular, how we can achieve it? Because if you only stay at that level as this slide shows, and that is very good, of course, as a thought-provoking publication, then I am afraid we might someday be asked by the mayor, yeah, but what happened really? What did you really do? And if we cannot respond to this question quite well and show really what it has done good to the city, then our funding will go, I think. So what is Green Search about? It is about developing the concept of urban green infrastructure further and helping local authorities around in Europe to adopt this concept and implement it. And of course, there's a definition. It's an interconnected network of green and blue spaces which together deliver ecosystem benefits to society. So this is the kind of easy version that we used in our project. And that was the starting point. So we asked ourselves in particular 4 questions related to this concept. That is one, how can we develop a better theoretical framing for developing such a green infrastructure? A theoretical framing that is in a way relational, that is not only looking at nature and the benefits it takes, but also sets this into relation to human society that is living in urban areas and that is also shaping this nature, enjoying this nature, and has a great role to play in the future planning and management of this green resource. So we need to come up with better framings than what ecology in a stricter sense can offer us. That was one of our challenges. Then we wanted to improve the evidence base on green infrastructure. Thirdly, we wanted to develop methods and tools for better valuation of this green infrastructure so that decision makers can better take it into account. And fourthly, we wanted to advance governance of urban green infrastructure by working on green infrastructure planning and governance in a broader sense. I will talk about this a little bit later. I think Green Search took an interesting approach, and one where we can also in this conference reflect further upon. And that you can see here in this, on this slide, in this diagram. On the top you see so-called work packages. And these work packages include one which is called biocultural diversity, ecosystem services, green economy, planning and governance. By the way, that's also an interesting, I think, aspect of this Green Search project, that we also really looked broadly at different themes to work on. So green economy was also a very important theme that we worked on. And then you see this funny helix, and below you see our urban learning labs, one of which is Malmö, or has been Malmö, but there have been others in Europe like Bari, Ljubljana, Berlin and Edinburgh. And the idea of the project was, or is, that we should develop something in close interaction between science and practice here. So it's not about yet another pure research project, but we wanted to develop a new knowledge tools and strategies conjointly. And these this approach is very strongly based in empirical studies and interaction on one hand with 21 European cities that you can see here for informing ourselves, for instance, about the state of green infrastructure planning. But then we have these 5 urban learning labs. And these urban learning labs, what are they? You may imagine that there have been a quite kind of platforms for the project where we could meet in a certain place, we could interact with Camilla and her team to discuss certain issues, we could support them by, at the lower level, so to say, with information, but we could also get involved in workshops in trying to work with them on certain issues that are important for them. For example, when the city of Malmö develops its green-blue infrastructure strategy, or is working on ecosystem services. And so the various researchers in the team dropped in and dropped out with their issues in the urban learning labs, more or less intensively. And then we had focal learning alliances also in this project, which was a particular tool for a smaller group of people as part of the urban learning labs to work on a particular topic. And I will show you in the next slide what these topics have been. For example, in Berlin, they have been concerned with advancing an edible garden, or making an edible garden at the Caspar David Friedrich School. So this was one topic they were working on. Malmö, it was the green and blue infrastructure planning strategy. In Edinburgh, it was about connectivity of green spaces and mapping pollinator hotspots and pinch points, for example, as that. And this was an intensive process of stakeholders in the municipality and from NGOs and of course the city administrative staff and so on. And we think this is a major experience for us, and it's a good result of the project that actually this, within the framing always of such a project and the funding it receives, it really worked, this kind of interaction. And just at the end now we did a kind of impact assessment, so Sander van der Jacht guided that with his group, and they found out that there are actually 4 dimensions in which this kind of interaction worked. It enhanced the conceptual knowledge, so the knowledge about green infrastructure between the participants of the ULLs. They got a shared understanding of what it is about, for instance, or about ecosystem services and other concepts. It increased the connectivity between the people working in a city. It supported to capacity building, so learning was an important part of the entire process. And maybe that last one is the hardest one, really, but there's also some evidence that it started to change some cultures of working, for example, not only in separate silos, but also working together. I think this is the hardest one really to achieve, but the urban learning labs and the focal learning alliances seems to be a possibility to enhance this culture change. And we may discuss how to continue with this and how to even improve on that process, maybe in future projects in this conference. So you will see also here there's a pointer to one of the sessions. I don't have the time to talk about all the sessions here in the conference, then I would need another 10 minutes, but you will always see here these pointers where I think this topic is most closely related to our Green Search project. And then, then this about theoretical framings. We used the term biocultural diversity to give a new perspective on the relationship between people and green space or their environment more generally. It's not invented by us, this term. It comes from, if I am right, anthropology or ethnography. And, but we have applied it exactly because we feel it does not suffice only to know about the diversity of green spaces or habitats in a city, but we equally need to take into account today the diversity of the people living in the city with the different attitudes towards green space, the different demands they have on green space, the different ways they interact with green spaces, or they want to take decisions on green spaces, or also getting a better understanding how to involve them in decision making on green spaces. Yeah? That is very important questions, and so we thought that this idea of that it's not only biodiversity but biocultural diversity might enhance developing new approaches for interaction between people and nature in the city. This concept distinguishes, that is as a result of our project, they distinguished between tangible BCD, lived BCD and stewardship BCD, and I will give you some ideas about that, what we mean by this in the following slides. Tangible BCD, one important step of coming to an understanding of what is really urban green infrastructure in cities was developing this typology. It was a kind of framing for us to understand what we are talking about, and it was also not only a typology as such. Well, one may wonder about why again talk about 30 or 40 or 50 green space types or so. That is not new, but it was important for us as a kind of joint platform where we did our work on. And also I think it's very important, this slide, because it shows you or us also the diversity of green spaces that we are dealing with in urban areas. And for me, it's also very important to highlight that this is not only about public green spaces, where of course public authorities are most concerned with, but it's all green spaces or open spaces in a city that are or can be part of a green infrastructure, including the blue spaces, as you see. And there are some sessions here also related to this that will particularly work on, for example, trees and or discuss trees as an important component of green infrastructure and blue spaces. And one session is dedicated to the typology. And then there have been a lot of studies in this project about understanding better the perception of biodiversity in urban areas and the green spaces in urban areas, understanding better how they are used and so on. So all the things that I mentioned before. And I would only like, so please don't be disappointed, the other groups, if I don't mention every work that has been done in this respect. I would only like to mention this one here, which I find particularly impressive. Alone for the number of interviewees that have been, or people that have been questioned in this research. And that really shows, so it's over 3,000 as you can see the number, and they have done their empirical work in all 5 urban learning labs. And that alone to me shows how important it is to have these kind of European Union funded projects, because where else could you do that? And their interest was, on the one hand, to establish the perception of biodiversity and the value that people give to biodiversity in these different types of green spaces. So they looked at streets, they looked at wastelands, at parks and at forests as for urban green infrastructure types. And they looked at different biodiversity levels with photo simulations and looked at how the people reacted to that. And then, of course, also, there was the other side. How do people react in Malmö, or how do people react in Ljubljana? And even more specifically, how do react the young people to this, and how do react the older people to this, socially more advantaged or less advantaged people to biodiversity? I think this is really quite unique, this approach, and it gives a lot of information that probably is even not yet fully used at the moment. But just to give you some ideas, and then I have to already be careful with the time. Interesting highlights, yeah, which are also sometimes in contradiction to what has been written in other places about this. People generally had a positive attitude towards all of these urban green infrastructure types. So also they felt that street greening can be important and a valuable component of the green infrastructure. Interestingly, the higher the level of biodiversity, the more they liked it. And that is a good news, of course, for the conservation of biodiversity in cities. But of course, regional differences matter. And this is expressed, for example, in how people use the green spaces. Walking was, in all of the 5 learning labs, the most prominent activity. But for instance, in Bari, the people did not like to walk through wastelands, whereas in Berlin, they are accustomed to that. They have no problem with that, and they use wastelands just as well. And that was also a very interesting result, I find, for all 5 cities, that wastelands, which we often consider to be rather ugly places, are frequently used in all 5 cities and are considered as an important part of the green space resource. So also this is a quite important finding. There would be a lot more to say, but time doesn't permit that. And there will be sessions also to further dig into these topics, as you saw on the slide. We also worked on other methods in our project, for example, assessment of cultural ecosystem services, a participatory mapping approach. Again, it's about how to better involve people in evaluating green spaces, not only thinking that we experts know it best. And that is quite interesting here. This was with over 500 participants, I think, this survey. And you can see how different green spaces, so these hotspots are showing where the people set their point on the PPGIS, the Public Participatory Geographical Information System, and what they find very interesting or important for these places. And it can be very different in these green spaces. Yeah? So the green spaces have different values, and that means we need to find also appropriate strategies or approaches towards the management of these that either strengthen further or preserve these values, or maybe also try to reduce the deficits in certain places. So very good approach. was also done in Lisbon. Here I show you that. And I only show this slide because also it's not about only values, but this gives also interesting information about, for example, what people don't like in certain parks. For instance, they say, okay, these ones are overrun, or they find them even scary, some places. They don't want to go there. And that is very helpful information, I think, which goes much beyond traditional ways of doing questionnaires in parks and so, where you're always very limited in how many people you can ask and so on. The project also then looked further into the benefits obtained by green spaces or the green infrastructure in cities. One study I show you here, this is about kids, so these little ones that we just had on the stage. And a big survey in Berlin was used to look at the health of these kids, how well they developed for their age, and then they tried to correlate this with the availability of green spaces or green infrastructure in the city of Berlin. And while this is not necessarily causative, these relationships, they are correlations, but they indicate that the more green spaces in a neighborhood, the better the development of the children. And this is certainly an aspect that needs to be explored much further, as very important for decision making, I feel. And we also looked at urban gardens, urban gardening, like traditional ones, like urban allotment gardens, but also the ones that are maybe now becoming very popular, also these community gardens, or however you want to call that. And we did interviews with gardeners in Lisbon, in Berlin, and in other places. And we got clear evidence that gardening is a very, very important activity in the city, because it's the way how you get a direct relation to nature. You learn from nature, but you learn also from your neighbors. So it's a very important instrument for social inclusion, also for strengthening social inclusion in cities. So this was one aspect we covered. And then valuation. Now, I'm not an economist, so this is something where I also need to get my head around of what they are talking about. But the group that was working on green economy did several things. And one is that they established in the first place, via literature review, for instance, what is the importance of green infrastructure for supporting the economy in a city. And actually it is important, that one can find out from different sources. For instance, it's a locational factor for some businesses. Cafes are more frequent around green spaces than further away from them. That this group did also assess via data that they had for Europe. It's motivating staff in working in companies, it's increasing the health of these people, and so on and so on. So a lot of evidence around that. But then also, of course, there are economic values like the increase of housing prices. So they could establish this, for example, for the city of Lodz, but also for Malmö. So on average, being 1% closer to the green space increases the sales price by 1%. If it's a park, if it's a woodland, it's even 2% for Lodz. But if it's a cemetery, actually the price goes down. and I'm just, yeah, it's like that. Even though people are using these cemeteries more like leisure grounds today than anything else. But for the sales prices, it shows me two things. One is that when you sell a house, it's a different perspective than when you use a green space. And, or maybe it's only that point. And that means that we need to have different approaches to valuation of green spaces. And what this group was particularly working on is also to try to integrate different approaches to integration, monetary and non-monetary approaches. I have to go over this for due of lack of time and try to finish with the last slides on planning and governance. Urban green infrastructure planning. I think everybody involved here or sitting here in this room is quite clear about that cities like Malmö play a very important role for developing the green infrastructure strategically in the long term. And they need to be equipped with the right instruments and the right knowledge to do this successfully. And that is what we have worked on in urban green infrastructure planning. So we understood it as a strategic planning approach, and that should be able to address all of these different challenges in cities at the same time. And we developed first a kind of conceptual approach for that is summarized here in this diagram. So of course planning is about assessments, developing plans, putting them into action and implementation, and involving actors. But then we said that green infrastructure planning in particular should follow 4 principles, and that is it should be multifunctional, it should be integrative, and that is what already Andreas Schirschem, I think, talked about. It should be connected green spaces, and it should be socially inclusive in the way how we develop this green infrastructure. This may be not so surprising. You may have heard about all of these different principles. But when we look at the reality, then on the one hand, we can notice that the situation in Europe doesn't seem to be so bad. This is from our 21 cities. And you can see that most of the planners that we asked said, yeah, okay. Green space has been increasing or maybe even been stable, but there are of course also other cases. But when we asked them further about these principles, then we noticed and looked at the strategies, then we saw that for instance, integration is still a principle that is hardly really put into practice in the cities. So there's a lot of scope for improvement. And so this group worked hard on supporting this improvement by looking at good practice cases and distilling in the end this guidance for green infrastructure planning that you have now in hand in your handbook. And that's the promotional slide. And in the same way, we realize, of course, that green spaces are made by people. And that people engage in making green spaces. It's not about the community, the municipality only, but about the community. And so a second group worked on green infrastructure governance, and they looked at bottom-up processes in particular. And there's a variety of these different kind of activities going on in cities. It's amazing, really. And some of them are maybe also promoted by the cities. Some are completely self-driven by the people living in a city, and here you can see some examples and a typology how to sort them. And this is quite important, this starting or sorting them, because we feel that it's an important role of cities also to support and enhance self-engagement by the people for different reasons. Because it increases social cohesion, as said before. Also because they add to the richness of the green infrastructure that cities could not do by themselves. And also because if we take a holistic view on urban landscapes and the green space typology that I showed you, then it's also about changing or preserving private green spaces. And for that we need the people, at least for that we need the people to involve and to motivate them and convince them that it's good to engage in green spaces. And there is another guide that resulted out of that, and one of the future challenges now will be, and that is also part of the discussion for this conference, I think, in some workshop, how can we well link these community-driven approaches, bottom-up approaches, with strategic development of the green infrastructure. I think this is the challenge ahead. With that, I come to an end. And of course, now comes the point where I have to particularly show one slide to Maria. Where's Maria? Hello, Maria. First of all, thanks so much for firmly supporting this project during its lifetime. And I know also from meetings that you really tried to push this issue, and you were always an excellent partner at the European Commission for us. And that is a little bit what we give you back. So this is maybe also for your statistics. all the things that we produced. Some of them are in this bag, so you can find them and read them there. Others are on the website. And some are more academic, as you can see here, papers and appearances on conferences and so on. But there is a lot, and that is the last thing I want to mention for this slide, was a lot of outreach activity, communication activity, interaction with stakeholders in this. And not least, I would like to say that Green Search as such had all in all close to 100 people working on the project for some time, not all of them for 4 years, but for some time. And I think also that shows you a little bit the impact of such a project, because most of them are young people, young researchers, and what they learned in this project, hopefully, they will also carry on in the next steps, and the same is hopefully true for the stakeholders that have been involved in the project. So I come to the conclusion that we met our objectives in this project, and that with that statement, I would like to hand over to Thomas.
I got it here.